All right, let's get started. Welcome, everyone. My name is Sue Harmon, and I'm a librarian at the Manchester City Library in Manchester, New Hampshire. Thank you for joining us today for the sixth and final part of the Culturally Curious Art Series this year, Jackson Pollock, Lee Krasner, and Abstract Expressionism, presented by Jane O'Neill. I'm joined by librarians from your hometown. This program was made possible by the combined resources of the GMILC's libraries, and we're very excited to be able to offer educational programs to you. Just a few housekeeping notes before we get started. This is a webinar, so all attendees are muted. Jane will answer questions at the end of the program, so please use the Q&A for questions, and feel free to use the chat to share your impressions and comments. Make sure that the message is going to everyone and not just the panelists. This program is also being recorded. In the next few days, you'll receive an email with a link to the program recording and a survey. Please take a few moments to tell us what you thought of the program. Your responses really do help us, and let us know what types of programs you'd like to see in the future. You can also sign up for your library's newsletter. You can also sign up for your library's newsletter to receive news on upcoming programs and library news. And Jane Martina joins us from the Hooksett Library with some information on an upcoming program.
Good evening, everybody. On Wednesday, October 4th, you can join us at the Hooksett Public Library from 6:30 to 7:30 p.m. for Becoming Wolf, Eastern Coyote in New England, presented by Chris Shadler. Attendees will learn more about these fascinating animals and will walk away with coexistence strategies. Registration is requested for this event, and to register, go to discover.hooksettlibrary.org and select events to view our calendar listings and register. We hope to see you there.
Thanks, Jane. And from the Nesmith Library, we have Maria Schroeder.
Hi, welcome. We have coming up next Wednesday, History and Mystery, a Genealogy Starter Guide with Erin Moulton, who happens to work at the Derry Public Library here in New Hampshire. So if you are around the Windham area, which is southern New Hampshire, we would love to have you join us. It's at 6 p.m. She will be talking about how to do genealogy research using Ancestry and other online and other primary documents. So I will put the link in the chat from our website where you can sign up or get more information.
Thank you. And from the Wadley Library. Right, I'm reading that. So, at the Wadley Library, The Queen is Coming. Cheryl Fay presents Her Majesty, which brings to life the reign of Queen Elizabeth II. This event will take place on Thursday, November 16th from 6:30 to 7:30 p.m. You can register online at wadleylibrary.org. And your presenter today is Jane O'Neill. Jane curates and delivers art appreciation programs to audiences throughout New England and beyond. Jane holds a master's in art history from Boston University and a master's in education from Harvard University. A New Hampshire native, she has worked at some of the state's most esteemed cultural institutions, including the League of New Hampshire Craftsmen, where she served as executive director, and the Currier Museum of Art, where she held the role of senior educator. Jane has also taught at the college level for more than a decade, most recently at Southern New Hampshire University. For more information, you can visit her website, iamculturallycurious.com. And without further ado, I will hand that over to Jane.
Thank you so much. And thank you everybody for taking time out of your evening tonight to learn a little bit more about Jackson Pollock and Lee Krasner. You're in for a treat because we're going to be diving deep into this. And I wanted to start off by actually congratulating you for being here, because I think for most people, this is really challenging content. I think it's rare for me even to meet someone who just says, I love Jackson Pollock or I love Lee Krasner. So if you're here because you love it, if you're here because you hate it, or you're just skeptical or curious, again, thank you for being here. It's wonderful that you're here. And my goal tonight is to enhance your understanding and appreciation of these artists and this period of art. So we're going to start off with a quick preamble. We will be getting back to this little detail of this painting on the screen in just a moment. But I wanted to give a quick little preamble that kind of talks about the evolution of art going back to the 1400s in Italy. This beautiful Annunciation scene over here on the left is actually from the Isabella Stewart Gardner Museum down in Boston. And what we see the artist doing here is using a number of artist tricks, including linear perspective. Look at those tiles that lead our eyes way back into this picture to create an image that looks like you could step into it or reach into it. Renaissance artists began creating the illusion of a window onto the world. And for roughly the next 600 years, that was the goal of art. And then by the time we get to the 20th century, we have artists like Picasso and Braque who begin to destroy that illusion and flatten out their images. And you can see with this painting by Picasso of a young woman, trust me, there's a woman in that picture, that he's using highlights and shadows in all of the wrong places to further flatten his image here. So over the course of the next few decades in the 20th century, Picasso basically has opened the doors for artists to experiment in brand new ways. So we see artists like Mondrian over here on the left, who's experimenting with geometric abstraction and fields of pure primary colors. Over on the right, we have an example of a painting from Miro, who is creating these little biomorphic forms, perhaps kind of summoning them from his unconscious and just delicately collecting them on this shallow field of the painting plane. And so it seems like it's almost this natural evolution towards something like a drip painting. Now, believe it or not, Jackson Pollock wasn't the first person to do this. These are actually paintings from the 1940s that predated him ever doing a drip painting. The image on the left is from the artist Hans Hofmann, and the image on the right is from a female artist named Janet Sobel, who Jackson Pollock actually credited as being a source of inspiration for him. But when all is said and done, by the time we arrive to mid-century, 1950, and we see Jackson Pollock's paintings like this, it almost seems like it's inevitable that it is the culmination of this trend that started way back around the turn of the century with Picasso. So some of the things that art historians have celebrated when it comes to a Jackson Pollock painting like this is that it's pure painting. It's not even an artist trying to create that illusion of a window onto the world. Instead, they're dealing primarily with just the raw materials, a flat surface and viscous paint. And they are working with that and that alone. So even though a work like this doesn't seem to have any historical references embedded in it, I think you could easily argue that it is a painting of its time. There's a little bit of the chaos and violence of World War II embedded in something like this, as well as the frenetic energy of modern life, really. So there's so much to say about this. We will, of course, be circling back to Jackson Pollock proper, but just to kind of round out how he fits into our culture and provide a little bit more context there. This, I always bring things back to Norman Rockwell, forgive me. Norman Rockwell even tried his hand at making a drip painting inspired by Jackson Pollock. And we can see from his cover from 1962 for the Saturday Evening Post, this work is called The Connoisseur. What Norman Rockwell is doing here is basically allowing every American to figure out their feelings about these kinds of paintings. There is, of course, kind of an old-fashioned connoisseur that we see from behind who's standing up close and assessing this picture. But because we see that figure from behind, we can project ourselves into his body and decide how we feel about this work. Apparently, Jackson Pollock's peers really thought that Norman Rockwell hit it out of the park with his abstract expressionist painting here. Notice that he also pays a little bit of homage to Jackson Pollock by including his initials here. You can see the J and the P. So Jackson Pollock and these his singular style really become integrated into the fabric of American life very quickly. And of course, we've all seen cartoons over the years that sort of reference his particular style of painting. At his birthday party, of course, he blows the cake and the candles and everything's like a mess on the walls. If he's going to sign a rent check, why wouldn't he just throw some, some black paint towards his checkbook? So whenever we see these references, I feel like there's a few things that are embedded in how we're thinking about Jackson Pollock. So the first is sort of questioning the apparent ease of execution. Who among us hasn't heard the phrase, my kid could paint that? Well, of course, this cartoonist here has answered that familiar quip by sort of saying, yeah, your kid could paint that if your kid is Jackson Pollock. And the other big idea that's often associated with these little references to Jackson Pollock that we encounter on a regular basis is this idea of the incredulity in terms of the value that's assigned to these works, because once again, they seem pretty easy to execute. So in 2006, there was a documentary, which I admit I still need to watch, but it's called Who the Bleep Was Jackson Pollock? And it's about this truck driver who purchased this drip painting at a garage sale and then spent like the next 10 years trying to get it authenticated and presumably get the money. It was said to be valued somewhere close to $50 million. So there's always this kind of tension around his brand of art in particular. Our fascination about Pollock continues to this day. So let's turn our attention fully to the artists at hand. We're going to get started with Pollock's early years. We'll see all of these elements that have kind of shaped him and prepared him for the drip paintings that we'll see when he catapults to fame. And then we'll finish up with him with his death and legacy, and then turn our attention to Lee Krasner, who was an abstract expressionist and married to Jackson Pollock. We'll assess her paintings, sort of a talent in the shadows, because certainly her husband got a lot more attention than she did, and then finish up with her death, legacy, and the conclusion. So plenty to cover. So let's start thinking about Jackson Pollock's early years. Okay, here he is. He was born Paul Jackson Pollock in Cody, Wyoming in 1912. And he only lived in Wyoming for about 10 months of his life, and then his family moved out to California. But as we'll see, this kind of tough guy cowboy mystique sort of sticks with him. And even as he's kind of breaking out as an artist, there are still people referring to him as a cowboy, incredibly. So he is the youngest of 5 sons. Here he is over here around probably 6 or 7. Here he is around the age of 16. And he was a troubled kid. He would go to art-focused high schools, but still get kicked out of the schools. There were a number of schools he got kicked out of. But pretty amazingly, even all of his brothers were sort of oriented towards the arts. So that was the direction that he was heading in. Now, he didn't have an easy upbringing. His father abandoned the family when he was a young teen, but he did have some formative experiences that seemed to sort of set the stage for an interest in these kind of wide open landscapes. And you could certainly make the case that these experiences that he had at, say, the Grand Canyon, that's what these images are of, might have influenced the larger canvases that he paints later on. So these are Pollock family pictures of him and his brothers hiking in the Grand Canyon. And one of the things that happens right around this time, when he's about 15, 16 years old, is he develops an affinity for alcohol. And add that to somebody who's already pretty troubled, and it's a pretty dangerous combination. So here we see a self-portrait by Jackson Pollock from about the age of 20. And I think if you knew anybody in your life who was painting themselves in this way, you might be kind of concerned about them. He was somebody that you should worry about. He said as a young man, people have always frightened and bored me. Consequently, I have been within my own shell. So it's pretty clear from all sorts of biographies and interviews and that sort of thing that he was suffering from some pretty serious psychiatric problems. Now, over here on the right, we can see him in a photo with one of his brothers. And his brothers played this integral role in his upbringing, in that they were always kind of there to protect him and save him from himself. They were there to rescue him. And I probably, in other terms, you might say even enable him in some ways. But because they all were interested in the arts too, it formed a real kinship with one brother in particular named Charles, who decided to move to New York City to pursue the arts. And Paul Jackson Pollock decided to move along with him and also give up the name Paul. So this was a formative experience. Once they got to New York City, they began to study with the artist Thomas Hart Benton, who we can see over here on the left in a photograph. On the right is an example of one of Thomas Hart Benton's paintings from the late 1920s. So this is the kind of work that Pollock would have been exposed to and sort of training on when he got to New York City. So first off, it's art that is figurative. It's not abstract, but Thomas Hart Benton has this wonderful way of abstracting his figures, of creating these long undulating lines. And then, of course, in the case of the cotton pickers here, he is making heroes out of laborers and making them incredibly sympathetic with like these incredible long lines of the figures. So Jackson Pollock would go on to say that essentially his experience with Thomas Hart Benton was just one that he could later kind of rebel against, that essentially Thomas Hart Benton had no influence on him. But take a look at what Pollock was painting in the mid-1930s. Cotton pickers. So in some ways, he was certainly influenced by Benton. Now, the 1930s were a desperate time for him and for the country. It's the Great Depression. So he is figuring out how to survive and make ends meet as an artist. Lucky for him, there were a number of New Deal programs during the Great Depression that helped to fund and sustain artists. So thanks to the WPA, the Works Progress Administration, and the Federal Art Project, the FAP, Jackson Pollock finally had a steady income for like the first time in his adult life. He also had other experiences that would, looking back, hindsight 2020, seemed to foretell what he would eventually arrive at. So for instance, in 1936, he was introduced to a number of the internationally renowned Mexican muralists. So Diego Rivera, David Siqueiros, who he is pictured with right here. This is Pollock and Siqueiros over here. Pollock went and worked at Siqueiros's workshop. And this is an example of the type of work that Siqueiros was producing at the time. This work is called Collective Suicide. And Siqueiros had very strong opinions about what the art of the modern age should really look like. He said it required new materials. A paintbrush is an implement of hair and wood in an age of steel. So he is asking the people in his workshop to paint with like automobile lacquer and lean into accidents and throw paint at the canvas. So all of this seems to have had a profound impact on Pollock and his later art making. One other experience that seemed to really influence him was his exposure to Pablo Picasso. He went to an exhibition at the Museum of Modern Art in New York City and saw these works by Picasso, including this one called Guernica from 1937, and they just blew him out of the water. He filled a sketchbook after sketchbook with essentially copies of figures and groupings from Guernica and from Picasso's exhibition. And he was quoted as saying, "That bastard, he misses nothing." So he had a tremendous respect for what Picasso was doing. And I think as we begin to look at some of Pollock's work, you might even see like these references to animals and women and birth and that sort of thing, probably filtering down from Picasso to a certain extent. Pollock also really loved and respected Native American art. He saw that at the Museum of Modern Art as well, including demonstrations where Native Americans were painting on the floor by dripping sand from their fingers. So that seems to perhaps have inspired some drip painting to come. But when all is said and done, the 1930s and really all of Jackson Pollock's life were marked by the fact that he was so troubled and had an addiction to alcohol. So, so what happens at the end of the 1930s is he begins to get therapy. He goes to 2 different therapists, and they're doing Jungian analysis on him. And part of that analysis is really kind of probing his unconscious. And believe it or not, his artwork, his sketches, his little drawings were used as part of that therapy. So these drawings over here were the types of things that he was producing, bringing into a therapist, and then they would kind of try to make sense out of it. So the alcoholism, the depression, or the mental illness combined together made Pollock unfit for military service. So he did not serve in World War II, which was just around the corner. Instead, he was lucky enough to meet Lee Krasner. And here we see the 2 of them together. I say that he's lucky because Lee Krasner provides this new stability in his life. The 2 artists met. They had been exhibiting together at a gallery in Manhattan, but they'd never crossed paths. So when that show ended, Krasner, who is really sort of self-possessed kind of person, just goes to Jackson Pollock's apartment without knowing him and was like, I need to meet this artist. And the rest is kind of history. Just a few years later, they got married. And like I said, Lee Krasner was this foundation really for him for the rest of his career. Sadly, she once said, Pollock was never happy from the entire time she knew him. So with that in mind, let's take a look at what Pollock was painting after he and Krasner get married. They get married right around the end of World War II. So these are these kind of primeval images that he was conjuring, no doubt in part inspired by Picasso, but also coming from deep within him. There's almost always a reference to women in these images. On the left, we have an image called Birth from 1941, and then on the right, She-Wolf from 1943. We can see that Pollock's works are still figurative, but he's come a long way from painting cotton pickers out in the field. He's not concerned with realism or the American experience. It's almost as though he's kind of exploring myth and these kind of primal fears and desires. So people, well, I should say curators in particular, kind of went crazy over this work, and in a good way. The curator of Pollock's first show, which included images like this, said, Pollock's talent is volcanic. It has fire. It is unpredictable. It is undisciplined. What we need is more young men who paint from inner impulsion without an ear to the critic or what the critic or spectator may feel. So there's something really primal, maybe even primeval, in these images. Obviously, there's references to figures here, but things are abstracted quite a bit. Okay. So from here, we have a major turning point in Jackson Pollock's career. And this is where we see him abandoning figuration essentially altogether. This is his wholehearted embrace of abstract expressionism, this idea that this is non-objective art. There is no reference to the world around us in this picture. This is just gesture, paint on canvas, expressing something from within inside the artist. So the year is 1943. This was painted for the art collector and gallerist Peggy Guggenheim. She commissioned Pollock to create this work for the entryway of her apartment in New York City, and the result is simply called Mural. Now, the work is dominated by these really dark arabesques that seem to sort of punctuate the canvas here. And then, but I don't know, every time I look at them, I'm sort of reminded of musical notes. There's something musical about this. And then around them, sort of accentuating them, highlighting them, are these little bits of color. There's some green, there's some pink and red, and a little bit of yellow. There's an overall consistency to the work, and then these mesmerizing little passages, like right here that seem to defy that consistency, but at the same time, don't break the overall effect here. So Pollock once referred to this work as being like a stampede. So once again, a little bit of a reference back to that notion of cowboy. Now, there's a great myth that goes along with how Jackson Pollock painted this work. This was a work that he painted upright, not down on the floor, and he painted it in his apartment in New York City. It's 19 feet long. He actually had to break down walls in his apartment in order to fit a painting this big. And according to Lee Krasner, his wife, he just stared at this blank canvas for weeks. He was like riddled with anxiety and creatively blocked. And then the night before the deadline, he just gets to work and works very quickly and executes the whole painting. That's probably more myth than fact, but there's some truth wrapped up in there. Believe it or not, art historians have done all of this careful analysis and have determined that there are layers of paint there. So, this mural brought Pollock fame, but it also brought out the critics. One critic panned it as exalted wallpaper. Ouch, purely decorative, right? Pollock said, there was a reviewer who wrote that my pictures didn't have any beginning or any end. He didn't mean it as a compliment, but it was. So what he's really saying is that this big mural here is meant to draw you in and completely absorb you. And what we'll see with so many of his works is that he inhabited them and then we inhabit them in a way that really before Pollock, I'm not sure we ever truly did. So continuing on, this is one of the only photos, I believe, of Jackson Pollock and Peggy Guggenheim here, who was obviously the collector that commissioned the work. Mural is just behind them. Now, there are rumors that there was a brief love affair between Jackson Pollock and Peggy Guggenheim, but there are confirmed reports that he was at a very highfalutin cocktail party at her house after he executed this work. And in front of everyone, he just began to urinate in the fireplace. So that gives you a sense in terms of how sort of wild, unbridled Jackson Pollock was, and also probably how drunk he was at that event too. So based on the money that he received from this commission, he and Lee Krasner were able to purchase a house out in Springs, New York, which is on the other side of Long Island, as far away from New York City as you can get and still be on Long Island. And so the move was really a strategic move on the part of Lee Krasner. This was a way to pry him away from his drinking buddies, and it proved to be really successful, at least for a little while. It was a turning point in Jackson Pollock's life and career. So let's talk about him catapulting to fame with just a quick reminder in terms of where we are in our timeline. These are tough images to look at, but it's just a reminder that they moved to Long Island. There's this shift in his career, literally on the heels of World War II. And so the world has just seen this unfathomable violence and atrocity. And now everything has changed. Everything's moving faster, communication, cars, everything. And America is now the leader in the world, not just politically, but militarily, and in all these other ways. And for the first time ever, really because of Jackson Pollock's efforts over the next few years, America will be the leader in the art world. This has never happened before. America has always been derivative from Europe, but on the heels really of this just absolutely brutal war, something happens in Springs, New York that sort of catapults not just Jackson Pollock, but America forward in this way. So there was a barn out behind Pollock and Krasner's house, and they moved it and they emptied it out, and that was to be his studio. It was unheated. There were you could see open air through the slats of this barn. It was not a glamorous place to work at all. Here he is heading inside, and you can just sort of see the pathos on his face. And then over here, Lee Krasner heading inside in front of him. But this is where he would be his most productive. So when he first gets going in this barn, one of the things that he does is he starts up making this figurative work like the birth picture and the she-wolf that we'd seen before. But then he begins to obscure the image. This painting on the left is called Shimmering Substance, and on the right is The Eyes in the Heat. And with both of these works, he goes back over it and he adds these veils and sometimes he's squirting the paint directly out of a tube, sometimes he's using a knife to kind of smear it, and sometimes his own fingers get right in there, but he's creating these purely abstract compositions as a result. And within the next year, these paintings come off of easels and he begins to create them on the floor using some dripping and some splattering. So these are works from 1947. We have Galaxy on the left and Reflection of the Big Dipper on the right. And as I mentioned before, he wasn't the first person to drip paint onto a canvas this way. And incidentally, Hans Hofmann, who had been doing it before him, had once counseled Jackson Pollock and said, "You need to stick closer to nature. Let nature be your guide." And Jackson Pollock famously responded with, "I am nature." So this is our reminder that Jackson Pollock was painting from within. He's connected to his unconscious in a way that other artists never intentionally tried to elicit in their art making. So going back to the Jungian analysis and all of this, he is conjuring something from within. He is nature. But when he first created images like this, the very first time, he goes into the house where Lee Krasner was, and he shows her what he's made, and he says, "Is this a painting?" He didn't even know. He didn't know what was happening, really. And of course, the rest is history in some ways. Jackson Pollock begins to consistently create these drip paintings on unstretched canvases on the floor inside that barn. They, of course, become his signature works. And he's not just dripping, he is flinging, drizzling, almost dancing the paint onto the canvas. He's using brushes, he's using turkey basters, and most often actually sticks with watered down, thinned out paint. And what we see is he makes these dramatic swirling patterns on the ground. So his gesture is really transferred to the painting. He described these works as energy and motion made visible. The critics called it action painting. It goes along with this idea that he's a cowboy, he's a tough guy. It's like an action movie, you know. So it also changes the way people thought of artists. Artists were sort of, you know, emotional, effeminate, and now you get this tough guy smoking a cigarette and making action paintings. So these works might seem kind of random, careless, accidental, but there's remarkable control in the way that Jackson Pollock created a painting. So let's go back to this work here, which is called Autumn Rhythm. It's also known as number 50. And just, I love it when the dates just make sense. This is from 1950 and it's at the Metropolitan Museum of Art. So I'm going to guide your eye through this painting, and maybe you already know how to look at a Jackson Pollock painting, but this is the way that I think is most satisfying to me, is I train my eye to look at one color at a time. And looking at that one color and the way that he's put it down, let's start off with the whites maybe, and thinking about how he moved around this canvas and what were the gestures that he created to create this fairly consistent shape and line of the white paint. And now if we go to the next color, maybe this kind of beige color, notice that it's got this angle to it. It's really kind of geometric in some ways, that he's very intentionally changing the way he's moving in order to lay down this paint. And then on top of it is this very thin, almost calligraphic black paint. And in some places, it gets a little thick and a little bit messy, but for the most part, it's this very light, loose, thin tracery work here. And then the part that always blows me away is this man who was so troubled and so often very drunk, had the control to not step on the painting. So we know he had it flat on his floor, and you don't see boot prints. You don't see a footprint. You get the sense that he's moving all around it, and he's being really careful in terms of how he made it. There's no evidence of his body here except for the gestures that he used in order to create it. Now, to kind of hit home this idea that there's control in these works, there are various researchers that have connected Jackson Pollock's works to geometric fractals. And I'm no expert in fractals, but like the most basic understanding of fractals that I can give you is essentially it's something that occurs in nature, and it's almost as though there's a shape or a form that replicates itself almost infinitely. So the tree branches here divide into two, and then divide into two, and then divide into two, and then divide into two. And it can sort of come out in other ways, but this is like kind of a simple way of understanding it. And it's so interesting that Pollock had said, "I am nature," and this is something that occurs in nature. So what's really incredible here is that fractals and the analysis of fractals have been used to authenticate Jackson Pollock's paintings. I can't tell you where the fractal is in this work, but I can tell you that these techniques have a 93% success rate in authenticating real Jackson Pollock paintings. So there was something that he was doing unconsciously that created this sense of pattern and rhythm in his pictures. So that's an incredible amount of control. Now, having said that, Jackson Pollock got all sorts of messy in these pictures. And this is just a detail where you can see that there are some things kind of embedded in this picture. So there are things like strings and sticks and cigarette butts. There's a key in one of his pictures, thumbtacks, buttons. I was watching an old documentary on Jackson Pollock a little while ago, and there was this guy who lived in Springs, New York, who talked about going to Jackson Pollock's studio at one point, and Jackson Pollock was like raging drunk. He broke a beer bottle. His feet got bloody, and he was like walking on his canvases. It might not have been true, but I can imagine that perhaps that did happen at certain points. So I will say that Pollock got sober. He got sober from 1948 to 1950, and this was, not surprisingly, his most productive and most creative period. So when we think about Jackson Pollock painting and creating these drip paintings, there's almost an obsession with how they were made. You almost can't you can't look at a Jackson Pollock painting without looking at a photograph like this and really reflecting on how his body was used and inhabited these paintings in order to create them. So there's only a few other artists in the history of art where we're obsessed with the making in the same way. I think for many years, people thought that Michelangelo painted on his back to create the Sistine Chapel ceiling. That's not even true, but maybe Frida Kahlo painting in bed because of the damage that was done to her body from the accident that she was in. But there's very few other artists that have this kind of particular story to tell. Now, Jackson Pollock wasn't the first person to paint on the floor. There's a whole tradition of that in Asian art, but there was something about his approach in American art that was still revolutionary. So he does paint from all different directions. He walks all the way around the painting, and he's just defying this convention of painting on an easel with an upright canvas that is then transferred to a wall in the same upright way. You could make the argument that his drip paintings could be hung in any direction because he made them from every direction. So I love these images of him painting because you can really see that there's something very graceful in the way that he put paint to canvas. You can almost imagine him drawing the image above the actual painted surface. So it feels like a dance when you look at them. Now in 1949, getting going, he's making these splatter paintings, and there is this pivotal article in Life magazine where he's standing there like a tough guy with his cigarette. And we have the question, is he the greatest living painter in the United States? Now, that's a question right there where you know it galvanizes people. It's like clickbait today, basically. So the article made him instantly famous. It still connected him to this kind of cowboy machismo thing. There was an art critic that said he could throw a skein of paint with the accuracy of a cowboy with a lasso. So he is the tough guy. But there's also embedded in the clickbait title here this notion that people are going to be instantly skeptical about this. We could all drip a painting, couldn't we? So people drew all sorts of conclusions and associations, sometimes unconsciously and sometimes explicitly, when they looked at his work. And oftentimes the association that they drew was one to bodily fluid spillage. So vomit, pee, ejaculate, it's all in there. There was a woman who once asked Jackson Pollock, how do you know when you finished a painting? And he apparently replied with, how do you know when you've finished making love? Believe it or not, there were researchers that dedicated chapters of a book basically to proving that Jackson Pollock had an obsession with urination, and that he would follow animal tracks or animal urination paths, and he would, urinate in all these strange places in New York City. To that, I have to say, well, he was an alcoholic, so he was probably peeing in a lot of places. But this idea that it's really connected to his body was always built in there. So as we continue on, I will say he got famous and successful so quickly. In 1951, Art News published a list of the best exhibitions of the previous year. Jackson Pollock's exhibitions were the top 3. When he was out drinking in New York City, young artists would go and touch him for good luck. He had that magic that summer. But unfortunately, he fell off the wagon. He began doubting himself. He began drinking again. And then basically his career was on a steady path downward. Now, I will just wrap up this section with just this question. How does one become famous making splatter paintings in a barn way outside of New York City? And the answer is this woman back here. This is his wife, Lee Krasner, and she was his champion. Lee Krasner fervently believed in his artistic genius, and she supported him. She supported his sobriety. She was constantly working the phones, calling galleries, critics, journalists, museums to make sure his work was being exhibited and seen and discussed. So she was critical to all of this. But we're going to wrap up quickly on Jackson Pollock and his death. Essentially by 1956, so a few years out past, this critical breakthrough at mid-century, he is frustrated, he's anxious, he's feeling awful about himself, and he's totally creatively blocked. One friend described him as being in a death trance. So that kind of perfectly sets the stage for meeting a young woman who's about 26 years old, who has a great deal of hero worship for him, and then a romantic affair starts from there. And of course, his already strained relationship with his wife, Lee Krasner, goes even further south. Now, interestingly, this affair that he starts with a woman named Ruth Kligman, she has shared that at this point in his life, occasionally he would have these moments of huge ego where he would say, there are only 3 painters, Picasso, Matisse, and Pollock. He really saw himself as important in the history of art. But then other times where he would just say, I'm no good, I'm a phony, so he kind of thought that he peaked, and maybe his little shtick people could see right through. So here we see Pollock looking kind of desperate, and here we see him on the last day of his life. There he is with Ruth Kligman. This photograph was taken by her friend, Edith Metzger, who had come out to Long Island with Ruth Kligman to visit Jackson Pollock as his wife, Lee Krasner, had set sail for Europe. So on this fateful last day of their life, the 3 of them went out to a party, and Jackson Pollock was driving around in his Oldsmobile very erratically, to the point where Edith Metzger was begging to be let out of the car. Ultimately, Jackson Pollock crashed the car less than a mile away from his own home. Edith Metzger was instantly killed. Jackson Pollock was instantly killed. And Ruth Kligman, the young woman that he was having an affair with, was the only one to survive. So you can think of this as an alcohol-fueled quasi-suicide, really. Jackson Pollock was only 44 years old when it happened. So as we think about his death and sort of what happens next. I love this photograph of him there with the skull. And over here on the right, we're looking at his gravestone in Springs, New York. He kind of perfectly fit the archetype of a tragic, tormented artist. Think of Vincent van Gogh, who suffered so horribly his entire life and then died prematurely. Isn't that what happened to Jackson Pollock too? He had really only painted for a few years, kind of like Vincent van Gogh, before he drank himself into invalidity. So right after he passed away, his star began to rise. The Museum of Modern Art hosted a retrospective of his work within 4 months. So people were already ready to kind of reassess him. And he became a part of the fabric of America really almost instantly. This is a 1952 beer ad over here on the right, but look what's in the background. It's a reference to Jackson Pollock, and people were just kind of supposed to get that. And what Jackson Pollock did for the art world was he opened doors in the same way that Picasso had before him. Essentially, after Pollock, you didn't need to paint in a traditional way. You didn't need to paint on a stretch canvas, on a frame, and you didn't need to exhibit your work on a wall. Your work could be about you. You could inhabit your work, and you could invite your audiences to inhabit them in new ways. The paintings that we're looking at over here on the right were done by the artist Sam Gilliam. They're from the late 1960s, and they're called Double Merge. So this is just one sort of direct line to how he influenced other artists. But for now, we're going to shift our perspective and turn our attention to Lee Krasner, because we have her to be thankful for all of this. One art dealer once described Lee Krasner as, well, he said that Jackson Pollock was her creation, her Frankenstein, and in many ways, she got to shape him. We'll get a better sense of that too, but she also got to shape his legacy and determine and authenticate the works that existed that were out there. So let's turn our attention fully now to Lee Krasner, who I'm assuming you probably don't know as well as Jackson Pollock. Here she is as a little girl sitting here on the right alongside her sister. She's actually the youngest of 6 kids. She was born in 1908 in Brooklyn, New York. Her actual given name was Lena Krasner, and she came from a Ukrainian Jewish family. So she was the only one of them to be born into the United States. And though they didn't come from any sort of place of privilege, she said, I was brought up to be independent. I made no economic demands on my parents, so in turn, they let me be. I was not pressured by them. I was free to study art. It was the best thing that could have happened. So I won't go through the entire list of where Lee Krasner studied, but I will reassure you that she had an extensive education in the arts and in modern art in particular. She studied art probably for much longer than the average artist or art historian. But what we're looking at here is a self-portrait that she created when she was about 19 years old. She was trying to gain acceptance into a program at the National Academy of Design where you have to submit a self-portrait. And they actually didn't accept this. They said, don't ever pretend you painted this outdoors. But I love this self-portrait because of this piercing gaze that she has, where we know that she's assessing her own likeness, but I feel like she's giving us a sense of who she is in this world. And it's right around this time where she drops the name Lena and she opts for the more androgynous Lee, which I'm sure she assumed could probably help her in the male-dominated field of art making. So we have a sense that she's got a very strong sense of self. Over the next few years, she is working with the artist Hans Hofmann. He's working in this kind of neo-cubist style, and so is she. So it's kind of updating the ideas from Picasso from a few decades back. She continues to study. She's really understanding all there is that goes into making a modern painting and kind of the foundation, art historically speaking, for it. And what ends up happening is that she is able to do that for Jackson Pollock too. So this extensive education that she has serves them both. From there, it's the 1930s. She works as a waitress to support herself, and then she also gets tied into those New Deal programs, the Federal Art Project, and she is working with artists who are making murals, abstracted murals over here like this one, and her job specifically was to help to enlarge the sketches for the murals. So she wasn't totally empowered, but she was working in the arts, which she was pretty excited about. And then she meets Jackson Pollock and everything sort of changes. And yes, this is kind of like a housewife type picture here, right? She's willing to give up a lot in order to play this role of wife and champion of Jackson Pollock, who she saw so much in. So while he worked in the barn at their house in Spring, she set up a studio inside. She continued to work. Her work was much smaller by necessity. She wasn't given the same amount of time that he had to work. So that impacted her artistic output. But this is when her training in the arts really helped to buttress him, because she gave him insight. Here's how you frame your work. Here's how you could do something different to tie what you're doing into this whole history of art making. So she really shaped him in so many ways. And as a result, she was also shaped by what he was doing. She was very much influenced by the freedom of his expression as he was painting out in that barn. So let's take a look at what Lee Krasner was painting. So at the same time that Jackson Pollock is beginning to drip and splatter his images, she's inside their house creating a painting like this, which is simply called Untitled. It's from 1946. And here we see all of these strong gestured marks, these black lines throughout the picture. They almost look like they would form letters or shapes. Your eyes are just kind of constantly searching through them to kind of make some sense of them. But that's a rhythm. That's how she is moving your eye through this image. And then kind of stippled on top of that are these really bright, beautiful colors. I mean, they're gorgeous colors. There's like a whole candy rainbow here. So we can see that she's got this wonderful sense of rhythm. It plays out a little bit differently from her husband's here. Now, as Jackson Pollock begins to obscure the figure in his works, she's trying her hand at the exact same thing. So this is a work called Untitled it's called Abstract Number 2 from 1947. And interestingly, both of these artists decided to just start numbering their works around this time. They felt like if you gave it a name, people tried too hard to find that thing in their painting. So she too was densely layering her canvases, perhaps obscuring figuration as well. But I really love this picture because it's almost like a challenge to kind of figure out how she made it. What were the colors that she laid in first? Obviously, there's a blue background here, but there's more than just the blue in those backgrounds. You can kind of like peek through these little windows here and see more happening. But did the white come in next? Did these kind of fat black lines come in? And then we see the reds and the yellows that sort of dance through this like autumn leaves falling from the sky. So there's just these fascinating layers to what she was creating. And here's thing about Lee Krasner. She never had a signature style. She never stuck with one thing. So just a few years later, she's making these really sort of structured, almost obsessive canvases. This one is simply called Composition from 1949. And I love that we've got this almost like a city-like grid made out of the white paint here. And then these muted colors in the background seem to be contained by that white grid, adding a little bit more structure. There's all these wonderful surprises in here. I feel like these works just pay off. The longer you have to look at them, the more exceptions to the rules that you find. They're just really fun. Now, incidentally, both Pollock and Krasner exhibited in a show called Artists, Man and Wife in 1949. And the reviewer from Art Forum or Art News said, there's a tendency among these wives to tidy up their husband's styles. Lee Krasner, Mrs. Jackson Pollock, takes her husband's paint and changes his unrestrained sweeping lines into neat little squares and triangles. Feel like that's not really fair to her, but okay. So Lee Krasner, like I said, she kind of moves around a lot in her style. She's constantly exploring, but she's also incredibly hard on herself. So if she creates a body of work and she doesn't like it, or maybe even years later goes back and doesn't like it, she would destroy it. But to her credit, she would tear it up and then integrate it into a new work. And that's what we see here. All of these passages that have these kind of black painted splatters on them are just a sheet of paper that she ripped up. And after a while, she decides that she's not trying to hide any sort of figuration. She wants to almost play hide and seek with her viewers. So she called this work here, I believe it's called Bald Eagle, and this is from 1955. In fact, her art dealer said, every now and then Lee Krasner would call him and say, come over for dinner. And he knew he was in for a hilarious night because they just basically drink and look at her works and try to figure out funny names for them that would probably drive people wild. So you look at something like this and you're like, where are all the bald eagles? So one more painting from Krasner here prior to Pollock's death. This is an image called Shattered Light from 1954. And this is another collage. She really excelled at collage. So we have all of these little torn paper pieces, most of them off-white or tan. Some of them are blue and yellow, but they're affixed to the surface of an oil painting. And so we can see these broad brushstrokes just sort of peeking their way out from it. So we have the sense of depth in this completely abstracted painting. And whether or not we want to read into the title here, but Shattered Light, you almost feel like you're in a forest looking up at like the light coming down through the trees. You can probably create 1,000 associations with something like this. But she creates these completely abstract expressionist works that, once again, I feel like really pay off the longer you look at them. I'm just noticing now, like, you know, these little kind of dalliances where she seems to be drawing on them, in other places where there's just like a swirl of energy, but sort of like Pollock's mural that we saw before, where there's this total overall effect, but then all of these ways that they deviate from that within the composition. And it's just so much fun to find and explore. So Lee Krasner's husband passes away in 1956. And she continues on. Believe it or not, she moves out to the barn where he had been working. She kind of has it updated for her own purposes. And doesn't she just look so self-possessed here? She starts creating these giant canvases. Occasionally, she starts ripping up some of her husband's old work and integrating it into her work. I can imagine those are real collector's items today. Now, we'll wrap up with Lee Krasner just to say that she was never just one thing. On the left, we have a work called Untitled from 1969. And we have all these soft forms. They're almost like little musical notes here, just floating on this field of green with a little bit of this like neon yellow sprinkled in between, but it's all soft edges. Everything is kind of rounded here. And you contrast that to this work on the right that's called Imperative from 1975. This work is at the National Gallery of Art. And it's gray and it's cold and it's hard edges that remind me of like icicles and sharp objects, really, with just a little bit of color laid in there, no doubt collage pieces from other works that she created. And if you look really closely, you can see that these are like those neo-cubist drawings that she'd been doing back in the 1930s. So she had a lot to say over a very long career, and not one thing defines Krasner's art making. So we'll quickly finish up with her death and legacy. Don't you just love this portrait of her. Lee Krasner passed away at the age of 75 in 1984. And wonderfully, before she passed away, she was able to see a retrospective of her work that was, it had started in Houston, traveled all around the country, but just after she died, it went to the Museum of Modern Art in New York City. Believe it or not, she's one of only 4 female artists that have ever had a retrospective at the Museum of Modern Art in New York City. So her work sells pretty well today, anywhere between like $1 million and $10 million. That sounds great, but pales in comparison to the fact that Jackson Pollock's paintings can fetch around $200 million. She was also buried in Springs, New York, in the same cemetery as her husband, not too far away, and not in his shadow, I would say, but a much smaller stone here. Now, she kind of had the last laugh because she was the person who got to determine the legacy for both of them. She made sure all of his papers went to the Smithsonian, as did hers. She was, like I said, in this kind of unique position to authenticate his works, to tell the story of his life. She started a foundation in their names to support individual artists who needed financial assistance. And then that house in Springs, according to her will, was turned into the Pollock Krasner House and Study Center, and it's available for you to go and visit. So if you feel like doing a road trip, you can just drive down to Connecticut, take the ferry across to Long Island, and seasonally, you can go and visit the house and the barn. You can go into that barn where only recently they removed the floor that she had put down when she took over the barn, and it revealed where Jackson Pollock painted and where he created his masterpieces. You can even see the edges of identifiable paintings on the floor, and you can see the marks that she created while she was painting on the walls here. And I think that it would be quite thrilling to stand in that space and think of the creative work that had been done there in the past. So we'll end with just a couple of big ideas about these outsized artists here. In the end, it's clear that Pollock and Krasner would not have become the artists they were without each other. Pollock benefited from Krasner's support, her knowledge of modern art, and the art world connections that she forged on his behalf. Without Krasner, he literally might have just died drunk on the streets of New York City. Krasner, in turn, was inspired by Pollock's improvisational and innovative style and approach to art making, and that really liberated her practice. She stood in his shadow during his lifetime, but her connection to him, no doubt, helped to keep her relevant for the rest of her career. She protected his legacy and she forged her own alongside it. So no matter who you think is more deserving of recognition or praise, I hope tonight's program helps you come away with a more complete understanding of these two remarkably talented artists. So I will end there for now, and I welcome any questions or comments you might have about Pollock or Krasner, and I'll do my best to try and answer them. Let's see here. Going to start with the Q&A here from an anonymous attendee. It says, I think Krasner was incredibly more talented than Pollock in pushing her vision and talent. However, do you think Pollock would have done the same had he lived? I guess we'll never know. And that is the answer right there, right? He really didn't seem to have it in him to, well, A, promote himself, and B, to kind of find another mode of expression. So he did create works in another style after he passed away, or before he passed away, and they were not received well by the critics. So that sort of lended to that idea that, you know, I'm a phony, I'm a one-trick pony. But she seemed to be continuously creative throughout her career. So it's interesting to think, you know, if he had survived, if he had lived, how would that have affected both of their careers and their legacies? So I'm glad you asked the question. Somebody else asked, do you know the 4 women who had the MoMA retrospectives? Let me see if I have that in my notes. I don't believe I do. Sorry about that. Offhand, I'm trying to remember who they were, but I recall like two of the names you would definitely know, and one of them I was even surprised by. But if you go back and sort of look up, Lee Krasner, MoMA retrospective, you might be able to dig that up. I'm sorry, I don't have that in my notes. Let's see here in the chat. Let's see. And I just have to say, I love that people tuned in from all over the planet. I'm incredibly humbled by that. So thank you, everybody, for being here. Let's see. Kat, thanks for being here tonight and for your comments. You and I have a personal connection, and I don't even know if you know it. Maybe we can chat about that offline. Thank you so much for the kind words. Aurora, I'm so glad that you're here too, and I really appreciate your kind words. They mean a great deal to me. So thank you, everybody. Let's see, there might be one more question here. April asks, how many works did each artist, how many works did each of them make? I don't have that number offhand. And I think it's sort of a tricky issue when it comes to Pollock, like what's considered a finished work, what isn't. And who gets to authenticate them and that sort of thing. So I apologize that I don't have that number offhand, April, but I'm going to write a note to myself to look that up. And I will say that one kind of interesting story that's related to that is that his Pollock's young mistress, Ruth Kligman, the woman who survived the automobile crash, later in life said that Pollock had made her a painting. And she tried to get it authenticated and spent, I think, like the better part of 10 years trying to get this drip painting authenticated. And essentially the powers that be, i.e. Lee Krasner, said, no way. So it was eventually auctioned off, I think, for close to, I want to say $10 million because probably of the strength of its associations with her. But this whole issue in terms of what qualifies as a painting is certainly a thorny one. So thanks for the question, April. I'm sorry I don't have that direct info you were looking for. And I think that just about gets to it. I don't know if I've missed anything else, let me know.
I just had one comment. I would love to see one of these paintings from either of them, like up close and personal, because I feel like you were talking about viewing like each of the different colors.
Yeah.
And I feel like you could go right up to it and get like right like inches away and be able to just like look at all the details and then step back and look at it as a whole and just have your brain just try and find patterns that might have accidentally, come to be in the painting. And there's just so many different ways to look at the paintings that, like you said, if I had like half an hour to an hour to like just look at one of these gigantic paintings, I'm sure I could absolutely spend an entire,
So for your next vacation,
time, just like
you're gonna have to go to New York City and just sit at the Museum of Modern Art. Yeah. And just definitely. Like let these paintings, you can inhabit the paintings.
They probably don't let me get as close as I want to get. For understandable reasons.
I think, oh, Maria, thanks for looking that up for us. I really appreciate you. Oh, in New Haven, Connecticut, there's a small Jackson Pollock museum. Linda, I didn't know that. Thanks for sharing that. Now I'm going to have to look that up.
Maybe New Haven's a little closer.
Museum. So maybe you don't have to go all the way to MoMA. But I will say there's something very moving about these images, at least for me. And I don't go around saying like I love Jackson Pollock's work, but when I have an experience with them, in real life in front of them, they are very moving. And then I mean, and just tied into it is like thinking about how troubled and tortured he was, and that he was able to create something that had all of this accident and control in it. Incidentally, he got really upset when people would write about his work and refer to it as chaos. One time he actually like sent a telegram to Time magazine and he said, "No chaos, damn it." So he really prided himself that this was all under his control.
Well, thank you so much, Jane, for such an awesome presentation. This program was recorded, and if you are hoping to get the recording, if you were registered for the program, you should receive it in the next couple days. And if you know someone that missed it, but they were registered, they'll also receive that link. But you should be getting it soon. If you know someone who wasn't registered and they want the link, feel free to share it with them. We'll have it up and available to view for a little while. They can also email me at the Manchester City Library, library@manchesternh.gov, and I can send a link to the recording to anyone who requests one as well. Thank you again, and I hope everyone has a great night.
Thanks, everyone. Take care. Thanks for joining us.